So welcome everyone to our REL Fall Distinguished Lecture Series 2020, jointly organized by the Department of Religious Study and REL Graduate Council, University of the West. My name is Miro Sakya, and I'm a chair of the Department of Religious Study. Today, I'm honored to have the privilege to introduce our distinguished guest speaker, Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi. So Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi is an American Buddhist monk from New York City, born in 1944. He obtained a BA in philosophy from Brooklyn College and a PhD in philosophy from Claremont Graduate School. After completing his university study, he traveled to Sri Lanka, where he received novice ordination in 1972 and full ordination in 1973, both under the leading Sri Lankan scholar monk, Venerable Palangoda Ananda Maitreya. And from 1984 to 2002, he was the editor for the Buddhist Publication Society in Kandy, where he lived for 10 years with the senior German monk Venerable Nyanaponika Thera at the Forest Hermitage. And he returned to the US in 2002, and he is currently live and teach at Chwangye Monastery in Carmel, New York. And Bhikkhu Bodhi has many important publications to his credit. Just named a few. And he either as author, translator, or editor. So these include the middle length discourse of the Buddha, Majjhima Nikaya, the connected discourse of the Buddha, Samyutta Nikaya, and numerical discourse of the Buddha, Untitled Nikaya. And recently he published Sutta Nipata, and his upcoming book is Reading the Buddha's Discourse in Pali, a practical guide to the language of the ancient Buddhist canon. It will be released in December 2020. And in 2008, together with several of his students, Bhikkhu Bodhi founded Buddhist Global Relief, a non-profit supporting hunger relief, sustainable agriculture and education in countries suffering from chronic poverty and malnutrition. And in an effort to support Buddhist global relief, I'm happy to announce that our US Graduate Council has raised $515 for this noble cause. And thank you for all the students and faculty who have donated so far. And today, the topic for today's lecture is From Suffering to Joy, From Joy to Liberation. So based on the Upaniska Sutta, Samyutta Nikaya. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Bhikkhu Bodhi.
Okay, so I should take over now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so good evening, everybody, and thank you all for joining this lecture through the University of the West. Yeah, I'm going to base my talk this evening, I call it the evening, for you it's the afternoon in California, on a sutta that occurs in the Samyutta Nikaya, in the chapter of the Samyutta Nikaya on dependent origination. And the sutta is called the Upaniska Sutta. So it's the discourse on proximate cause. And I'm not going to be dealing with the sutta in its entirety because the chief point of the sutta is all recapitulated in a passage that comes towards the end of the sutta. So it would be sufficient for us just to turn to this passage at the end of the sutta, which I highlighted in the file that I sent this morning to Vaishali. Now, what I find particularly interesting about the sutta, maybe its special importance of the sutta, is that it joins together two sequences of conditioning factors that we find presented throughout the Buddha's teachings. It joins them together into one series. one sequence, which is the main theme of this particular chapter in the Samyutta Nikaya, is the sequence of the 12 links of dependent origination. And the other sequence is a sequence of the factors that culminate in the ultimate goal of the Buddha's teaching, the attainment of liberation. And what unites these two sequences, what joins them together, is the fact that both of them show that the principle of conditionality lies at the basis both of the process that maintains our bondage to the cycle of repeated birth and death, and thereby to repeated dukkha or suffering. And the same principle of conditionality underlies the process of spiritual development that ends in the attainment of liberation. But there's a difference, it seems, in the way the principle of conditionality operates in the two cases. In the case of the process that sustains bondage to the cycle of birth and death, the process of conditionality, I say it's cyclically reinforcing, in that we go from ignorance through a series of further conditions leading to craving, to clinging, to karmic activities that will generate new birth. And then following new birth, normally there will be growth, then old age and death. And in the normal process of life, as we move from birth towards death, we will engage in new rounds of craving, clinging, and karmic activities that will lead to further existence, the renewal of existence, more birth, old age, and death. So this is why especially the commentaries speak about samsara as they use the Pali word vata or Sanskrit varta, which means a cycle or a round. So this is the round of repeated birth and death, whereby conditions lead to further factors which produce more conditions. And so you could see that birth eventuates in death, death is followed by new birth, and the process goes on in a potentially endless cycle. In contrast, the process of, or the stages of conditionality that lead to liberation functions in a somewhat different way. Rather than operating in a repeated cycle, it operates more as a kind of, maybe call this a ladder, in which one step serves as a foundation for the next step, which in turn serves as a condition for the next step, and so on, culminating in a complete liberation from the cycle of repeated existence. So in this way, one conditioning factor empowers the next one, and that one in turn empowers the one that comes after this. And so that the conditioning factors build up, I'd say they build up a increasing intensity, an increasing force, which gains the capacity, the power to break the bonds that hold us in bondage to the cycle of repeated birth and death. So perhaps it's for this reason that in its exposition of both sequences of conditions, normally the suttas will use the word paccaya. Maybe I could put this into the chat box. To indicate a condition, they use the word paccaya. But in this sutta, instead of paccaya, the word that's used is upanisa, with the ending with the long A, which is what I translate as proximate cause. But the idea that seems to underlie the use of this word is that each of these factors is supporting the arising of the next factor. And so as one arises with the support of its predecessor, together they build up a cumulative force, which in conjunction, all of them operating together in a kind of synchronicity, are able to generate that momentum that can propel the citta, the consciousness, beyond the constrictions, the confinements of the defilements, and propel it towards that state of liberation, the state that's called in this sutta asava kaya, the destruction of the asavas. And so first, maybe we just take this expression, the destruction of the asavas. And I use this word without translation in the file that I sent earlier today. So the word asava comes from the root, the verbal root su, su, which leads to a verb savati, which means to flow. And then to that flow, to that primary verb, one adds the prefix, the long a, to get asava. And asava gives the nuance of a direction to the flow. And so the question comes, what is the direction of the flow? Is it in or out? And the commentaries explain that we can understand the word asava in both ways, either as things that flow into the mind, maybe from the deep strata, the deepest strata of the mind, things that flow up into active consciousness, generating our thoughts, our emotions, our volitional activities, and so on. And also the asavas can be seen as things that flow outward, that flow out through the senses to the objects and engage us in our relationship to the objects of experience. And so for this reason, asavas can be, the word asava might be translated either as, some use the translation influx, meaning things that flow in, and others have used the translation outflow, things that flow out. I found the Chinese translation of this, the ancient Chinese translation, very interesting. I don't have the character at at my fingertips right now, but the Chinese character is lo, which the character conveys the image of a building into which water is leaking. So perhaps a good rendering, though I've never used it for asava, would be leakages. So these are the defilements underscored, which are being underscored in the way they leak into the mind. So that the mind is compared here to a building, and the asavas are like accumulations of water, maybe after a downpour, or maybe water seeping up from the ground, and the water leaks into the building and causes corruption, corrosion within the building, causes mold and mildew to form, just the way the defilements corrupt and corrode the mind. I see Ivan has sent the character. Yeah, so it has the water radical, and then the image of a building, and then beneath that image of the building, there's the character for rain. So rain coming into the building in a way that's undesired, maybe through a crack in the roof or cracks in the walls. Okay, so the way the Buddha often expresses and formulates the aim of the teaching is as the destruction of the asavas. And so we raise the question, like, what are these asavas to be eliminated, to be destroyed? The most ancient texts enumerate 3 asavas. So these are the asavas of sensual desire, in Pali called the kamasava, the asava of craving for existence, the bhavasava, the craving that drives us to seek ever further existence, usually seeking superior states of existence. But because we often behave in unwholesome ways, the craving for existence often brings us to undesirable lower states of existence. And then the most basic asava, the fundamental asava, the most fundamental asava is the asava of ignorance, the avidya asava. And it's actually the asava of ignorance that lies behind the other 2 asavas. The asava of ignorance that underlies sensual craving, and again, the asava of ignorance that underlies the craving for repeated existence. So therefore, the Buddha says that the key to overcoming and to eliminating the asavas is wisdom, or correct penetrative knowledge. So at the beginning of this Upaniska Sutta, he says that the destruction of the asavas is for one who knows and sees. This is jnana plus dasana. So it's the knowledge of things as they really are, seeing into things as they really are, that has the capacity to overcome and to eliminate the asavas. And then he expounds on this type of knowledge and vision. It's the knowledge of the 5 aggregates, material, form, feeling, and so forth, their origin, and their passing away. But I'm going to come back to this later. Okay, now I want to go quickly through the body of the sutta and then come to the main passage that I want to elaborate upon. Okay, the Buddha traces the knowledge of liberation, the knowledge of the destruction of the asavas, through the sequence of conditions coming back to faith. Then from faith he goes to suffering, and then from suffering to birth, and then he goes back through the familiar chain of the 12 conditions of dependent origination until he comes to the sankharas, the volitional activities, which are in turn conditioned by ignorance. Okay, then after tracing the chain of conditions back to ignorance, then he repeats the sequence, but now in direct order. So he starts off saying, with ignorance as the proximate cause, the volitional activities come to be. Then with volitional activities as the proximate cause, we come to consciousness, and then through the familiar links in the chain of dependent origination, till we come to, with ignorance as the proximate cause, there's birth. And then normally in the sequence of dependent origination, we go from birth as condition, there is old age and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. But in this sutta, the Buddha does not go from birth to old age and death, because if he did so, he would simply be expounding the familiar sequence of conditions that sustain the process of repeated existence, repeated becoming. And in this sutta, he wants to show the way to liberation from that cycle of repeated existence. So he can't go from birth to old age and death, because if you die, then you just come back to new birth. But rather, he goes from, he says, with birth as proximate cause, there is suffering. So now we come to the suffering that we encounter in the course of our life, not yet coming to old age and death, but the normal suffering or dukkha, dissatisfaction, discontent, frustration, unhappiness, misery, pain, or feeling of lack that we meet in the course of our life. And when we encounter that dukkha, that ordinary exposure to suffering and dissatisfaction, well, normally a person who doesn't have any glimmer of wisdom will seek to overcome that suffering just by self-indulgence, usually indulgence in sensual pleasures or by worldly enjoyments, which will temporarily blot out the felt discontent, dissatisfaction, and sense of lack and inadequacy. But here we're going to speak about, the sutta is going to speak about a person who somehow, maybe through an accumulation of merits, through previous existences, takes that encounter with suffering as the trigger to embark on a spiritual quest. And this quest will bring the person into contact with the Buddha's teaching, with the Buddha Dharma. And that encounter with the Buddha Dharma, because this person presumably has an accumulation of meritorious supporting conditions, that person encounters the Dharma, hears the Dharma, maybe encounters the Buddha himself or a wise disciple of the Buddha, and through that encounter, there arises, conditioned by that suffering, there arises saddha or shraddha, which we translate as faith. So that is sort of the indispensable starting point for embarking on the quest for liberation. It is the gaining of faith. And what is meant by this faith? Within this particular context, it will be faith in the Buddha as the perfectly enlightened teacher, and in the Dharma as that teaching that reveals the true nature of our life, of human existence, of sentient existence, and that expounds, that reveals the path that culminates in liberation. And translators of Buddha's text into English have used different renderings for the Pali word saddha or its counterpart in other languages. Some have used confidence, others conviction, others trust. But I like to use the word faith because in my mind, faith combines at least two elements that enter into the concept of saddha as we encounter it in the early Buddhist texts. The two elements, the two primary elements which merge in saddha are, I would call this an intellectual element or a cognitive element. That is an element of belief, of accepting something on the basis of understanding, and an emotional element. That is, it's not just understanding something in a dry, detached, intellectual way, but it's understanding truths about the very nature of our life, the very nature of our existence, that respond to our innermost being, and that evoke a response that comes from the very depths of our being. And I would say that true saddha, well, let's say the deepest and most invincible saddha, faith or trust, arises when we come to the, I would say that deep and invincible saddha arises to the extent that we understand the real meaning and extent of dukkha. So if we see dukkha just in the rather narrow sense of experienced psychological or mental stress, dissatisfaction, discontent, then the degree of faith will be limited. But when we come to understand the Buddha's full disclosure of the meaning and range of dukkha, as he explains it in the structure of the Four Noble Truths, that all of our existence is encompassed within dukkha, and that beyond dukkha, there is a state of invulnerable, invincible liberation, then our faith will be strong, deeply rooted, and become a propelling force, leading us on to the path to liberation. And so the intellectual element, the element of belief here, is accepting on trust the Buddha's teaching that dukkha is not confined just to our immediate experience of suffering, but that dukkha encompasses all of our existence, all of our conditioned existence, and also understanding that this dukkha is rooted in craving, that it springs from craving, and that it is possible to gain liberation from dukkha by overcoming craving, not just by reducing craving, not just by gaining some peace and contentment here and now, but it's possible to fully uproot that craving and the ignorance behind it that maintains the suffering of our bondage, and thereby gain a state of irreversible freedom, liberation, freedom and liberation. And so when we come to understand the depth and the extent of dukkha, and to recognize that in the Buddha Dhamma, we have a teaching that will lead us to irreversible freedom from dukkha, that gives rise to this emotional response, that response of that's signified here within the sutta by the term joy. So we see that it is possible to be fully liberated from dukkha, and when we recognize this, there comes a sense of relief. First, a sense of relief that our search has now come to an end, that we found the teaching that is clear, that is direct, practical, realistic, and that is so constructed that it can lead us, as we adopt the teaching and put it into practice, that it can lead us to the ultimate goal of freedom from dukkha. And so the sutta says that based on faith, with faith as the proximate cause, there is joy. And now there is another sutta that comes in the Anguttara Nikaya, and I also included this in the file that I sent this morning. And this shows that there are certain stages that may have to come between faith and joy for true joy to arise. And this sutta is found in the Anguttara Nikaya I sent a version that occurs in the Book of Elevens of the Anguttara Nikaya, the first sutta. We find various formulations of the sequence in the Anguttara Nikaya. Most of it is very similar to that in the Upaniska Sutta, but the Anguttara Nikaya inserts between faith and joy two other factors. One is the undertaking of sila, that is, of ethical conduct, and then following upon the undertaking of sila, the absence of regret that is caused by transgression of the code of ethical conduct. And so when we gain faith in the teaching as our vehicle to liberation, when we start to put that faith into practice, we do so by undertaking a code of ethical conduct. If it's a layperson, the 5 precepts. If it's a monastic, the different versions of the monastic precepts. And through observance of sila, of the precepts, we start to cultivate the wholesome states of mind that underlie the precepts. We cultivate, instead of harming others, stealing, sexual misconduct, false speech, we develop such qualities as compassion, honesty, of fidelity and restraint, commitment to truthfulness, to sobriety, and so forth. And by adopting an ethical way of life, we start to feel the impact, the effect of ethical observances upon the whole tone of our life, the whole quality of life. We see that our unwholesome states start to diminish, wholesome states arise and become stronger, and this reinforces the joy and gives greater depth to the joy. Okay, when faith and joy become strengthened through the adoption of the Dhamma as a way of life, then to go further. The sutta itself doesn't mention this directly, but it seems here to me that between joy and rapture, there has to come the deliberate adoption of a meditation practice. And presumably this will be a practice of samatha meditation, of serenity meditation, whereby we learn, we take up a practice that will be conducive to the unification of the mind, learning to focus the mind on a particular meditation object. I'm not going to go into the different objects of samatha meditation now, but through taking up this practice of concentrative meditation, we learn to, based on our faith, based on the moral training, based on joy, we learn to focus the mind and to sustain the mind on a single object. And as the capacity for mental concentration, for unification increases, the waves and the commotion of distracting thoughts, of disturbing thoughts, of afflictive emotions starts to subside. And at intervals in our practice, sometimes either a short time, sometimes after a long time, there will come periods where the mind can remain sustained on its object for certain limited periods of time. And then it's as if we come to a kind of clearing in the wilderness, like we've been struggling to get out of this jungle, and then cutting away at the vegetation. And then at a certain point, we come to a clearing and opening. And with the discovery of that opening, even these brief periods of mental unification, the mind gets uplifted, elated with this feeling of, we use the Pali word, piti, a kind of refreshing, a wave of refreshment that comes over the mind and uplifts the mind and pervades the mind, floods the mind with that feeling of very deep joy and rapture. Even we could call this bliss. When it becomes stronger, a kind of ecstatic bliss. Okay, but that ecstatic bliss or that rapture itself, though it's, of course, it's something that we delight in, that we welcome, but it has a certain defect in it. And that defect is that it involves exhilaration, some element of excitement. And so to advance further, that excitement has to settle down. And it settles down simply by keeping the mind directed to the primary object, but using the combined forces of sati sampajanya, mindfulness and clear knowing, to recognize the rapture, to see it as a defect, something which is positive in itself, but which, if we become attached to it, it will block further progress. So we let the rapture gain its own momentum, but we don't indulge in it, don't become attached to it. And as we continue with the practice, using mindfulness and clear comprehension, sati sampajanya, to regulate and to subdue the rapture, then there arises a quality. In Pali, it's called pasadi. In Sanskrit, I think it's prashrabdi, which is I translate as tranquility. It comes a kind of stilling down of the disturbances of the mind, even a stilling, a quieting down of that element of excitement and exhilaration within rapture. And so the mind is becoming calmer and calmer. The rapture is still present, but it's not overwhelming the mind, not carrying the mind away. And so as tranquility becomes sort of dominates and overpowers the rapture, then there comes another quality comes into prominence. This is we use the Pali Sanskrit word sukha, which here I translated happiness, which is not quite accurate because it's not a general feeling of happiness, but rather it's more a specific feeling of pleasure, a kind of deep, but it's a wholesome pleasure, not sensual pleasure. A beautiful, wholesome pleasure that comes when the mind is settling and becoming still and focused on the object of meditation. As the tranquility becomes more prominent, and so tranquility is working together with joy and rapture and bringing to prominence this soft and subtle feeling of pleasure, which becomes more and more stable. And as the feeling of pleasure becomes stable, then the mind is able to settle down on the object with a more stable kind of one-pointed focus, and that is samadhi or concentration, where the mind becomes absorbed in its object. And here I'm not going to, sometimes people debate the question whether the concentration that's required in the process of cultivation must be concentration of the level of jhana, or whether a lower level of concentration is sufficient. I'm not going to go into that debate here, but just to express my opinion that the concentration doesn't have to amount to the level of full jhana. But a lower level of concentration is sufficient as long as the mind is capable of remaining sustained without wavering, without disturbance or distraction, as long as the mind can remain sustained on its object. Okay, all of these stages, I would say, from joy through samadhi or concentration, pertain to the development of concentration. So we could say that faith as the starting point provides the motivation for undertaking the training in ethical conduct, in sila. Then sila is the basis for the arising of joy. Joy leads to rapture, rapture to tranquility, tranquility to happiness or pleasure, and then pleasure to concentration. So all of these links within this liberating sequence pertain to the increasing ability to settle and focus the mind in samadhi and concentration. With the next link in the step in the series, we embark upon a new phase, and this is the phase that marks the beginning of insight, culminating in deepening panya, wisdom, wise penetration, and then leading on to liberation. And so the first phase in the development of wisdom or insight is called the knowledge and vision of things as they really are. In Pali, the expression is yatha bhuta jnana dasana. And this phase is indicated already at the very beginning of the sutta. If we just go back to the beginning of the sutta, where the Buddha says the destruction of the asavas is for one who knows and sees. And then he raises the question, for one who knows and sees what? And then he says, for one who knows and sees, such is material form, such its origin, such its passing away. And then the same for feeling, perception, volitional formations, and consciousness. So what we have here, of course, are the 5 aggregates. And so what one has to know and see first is what the 5 aggregates are, and then one has to know and see the arising and passing away of the 5 aggregates. And so from other suttas, we will know in greater detail what are the 5 aggregates. I'm not going to go into that now, but we have to be able to define what are the particular references of these 5 aggregates. Maybe for details, I could just tell you offhand, you can look in Samyutta Nikaya, chapter number 22, sutta number 56 will explain the meaning of each of the 5 aggregates. But the key point here, one has to be able to sort of home in on one's experience. And usually our experience just occurs as a kind of unified block, but one has to use the power of panya or wisdom to be able to dissect the experience into the fibers that are woven together to constitute the texture of our experience. And so when we use that penetrative capacity of panya, we can dissect the experience into a material component or physical component, this body with its 5 sense faculties, and then the mental constituents of feeling, experiencing the pleasant, unpleasant, neutral sides of the experience, perception, which identifies the qualities of objects, the volitional activities, which respond to different elements in our experience, and the consciousness, the awareness of what is occurring through the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and thought. Okay, so one identifies the five aggregates, and then we see that these five aggregates are subject to arising and passing away. And when we see the arising and passing of the five aggregates, this is the mark of impermanence. So we're seeing the first of the three characteristics to see the impermanence of all the five aggregates. And when we see the impermanence, then we see that these five aggregates are inherently unstable, unable to provide a lasting basis for security, and that they are subject to breaking up and to perishing, and thereby leading us into dukkha. And so when we see the impermanence of the five aggregates very deeply, then we could see the unsatisfactory, deficient, defective nature of the five aggregates. And that is the deep characteristic of dukkha, of suffering. And then when we see the five aggregates as being impermanent and defective, then we stop clinging to them and identifying with them as being I and mine and myself. In other words, we see the five aggregates as being anatta, non-self. And so to see things as they really are, expressed very concisely, means to see the nature of the five aggregates, the particular defining marks of each of the five aggregates, and to see the universal marks of the five aggregates as being impermanent, dukkha, and non-self. And of those three characteristics, all three of them eventually converge upon the characteristic of non-self. And so we could say that in the Buddha's teaching, the major cause of bondage is identification and grasping. Identification with the five aggregates by taking them to be the true I, what I really am, and grasping the five aggregates, clinging to them by taking them to be mine, my possessions. And so therefore, in the Buddha's discourse on non-self, after the Buddha goes through the three characteristics, he says, therefore, any kind of material form, whatever, any kind of feeling, perception, mental, volitional activities, consciousness, whatever, all should be seen as they really are with correct wisdom. Thus, this is not mine. This I am not. This is not myself. So that is the deepest level of seeing things as they really are, seeing the five aggregates as being not mine, not I, not myself. Then the next step is that the knowledge of things as they really are is the proximate cause for, here I use the Pali word, the nibbida, which I translate as disenchantment. So again, I'll put this. And the word nibbida is, again, is a word that's somewhat difficult to translate. But what's interesting is that it comes from the prefix near plus the root vid, which means to know. And so near vid, the prefix near sometimes has the sense of out, and vid means to know or even to find. So nibbida, if you take it literally, seems to mean finding out. What happens when you find out the real nature of the five aggregates? When you know and see the five aggregates as they really are, then you find out what they really are. And so finding out what they really are brings a kind of disillusionment, which in English, the word disillusionment often has a negative nuance to it. Oh, I'm disillusioned, so I become upset, depressed, dejected, feeling miserable. But if you look at the word disillusionment, it means the ending of illusions. So for Buddhism, the ending of the illusions is a really positive, desirable quality. You all along, we've been in the grip of the illusions by which we take these five aggregates, the I and mine, and we cling to them. We build up these divisions between myself and others. And I'm always trying to come out on top, to be number one, by putting others down and building up my own ego. And I'm always trying to grasp more and more belongings, property, wealth for myself, thinking that is the way to happiness. But now I've seen into the nature of the five aggregates, and I've seen not I, not mine. And this is a very freeing experience, so that when I become disillusioned with them, then I start to turn away from all of that grasping of the five aggregates as being I, mine, and self. And this is what is indicated, what I've tried to indicate it using the word disenchantment, because we are usually enchanted with the five aggregates and with the different experiences that these five aggregates make accessible to us. But now we've seen deeply into the selfless, into the impermanent, unsatisfactory, selfless nature of the five aggregates. So now we are turning away from them. And this, technically, this word disenchantment is explained in the commentaries as the higher, more advanced stages of insight knowledge. I think it's from the stages of knowledge of dissolution through the higher stages. So with the knowledge of things as they really are, we see into the five aggregates, but now we're seeing the five aggregates as constantly breaking up with true insight knowledge, as breaking up, dissolving, and passing away from moment to moment. And so there comes a turning away from them. And that turning away is indicated by disenchantment. And when disenchantment reaches its culmination, then it brings the next stage in the series, which is called dispassion. Dispassion is the Pali word that's used is viraga. So viraga is the ending that's indicated by the prefix v of raga. Raga, often translated lust, but it has the stronger sense or more broader sense of attachment. And so viraga is the ending, the cutting off of attachment. And particularly, it's the ending of attachment to these five aggregates, the ending of attachment to the aggregates as being I, mine, and myself. And this detachment or disengagement from the five aggregates goes through different stages. These are the different stages of realization. But the highest stage of realization is the stage that culminates in liberation, vimutti. Liberation is the freeing of the mind from the asavas of sensual craving, craving for existence, and ignorance. And so it's said that when you penetrate the Four Noble Truths thoroughly to the deepest level, then the mind is freed from the asava of sensual craving, freed from the asava of craving for renewed existence, freed from the asava of ignorance. So that is liberation. So it's liberation, that is the liberation in this life. And since it is the asavas that keep us in bondage to the cycle of repeated birth and death, the freedom of the mind from the asavas means ultimate liberation from the cycle of repeated birth and death. Then following the event of liberation, and that event of liberation marks the attainment of arhatship, then there comes a kind of reviewing knowledge by which the liberated person looks back at the mind and sees that the cycle of repeated births has come to an end. What had to be done has been done. That the holy life, the spiritual life, has been lived in its completeness, and there is no coming back to renewed existence. And that is the knowledge of destruction, the knowledge that the asavas have been destroyed, and that with the destruction of the asavas, liberation has been gained. And then in the Upaniska Sutta, the Buddha illustrates this with a beautiful simile. And so he says that it's like when the rain pours down on the top of a mountain. So the rain pours down and then the water flows down along the slope and it fills the cleft, the gullies and the creeks. These, when they're full, fill up the pools. When the pools are filled, they fill up the lakes. When the lakes are filled, they fill up the streams. The streams fill up the rivers. And then when the rivers are full, these fill up the great ocean. And I really think, though the sutta says that it brings in the whole sequence from ignorance down to the knowledge of destruction. But in my opinion, the simile really applies only to the liberating sequence. That is, when faith becomes full, then it brings joy. When joy is full, it brings rapture or elation. When rapture is full, it brings tranquility. Tranquility brings happiness or pleasure. Happiness or pleasure brings samadhi, concentration. based on concentration, there comes the knowledge and vision of things as they are. Knowledge and vision of things as they are brings disenchantment. Disenchantment brings dispassion. Dispassion brings liberation. And from liberation comes the knowledge of liberation, the knowledge that the asavas have been destroyed. Okay, maybe this can suffice as my basic talk. And then I think you said that we could leave some time, maybe 15, 20 minutes for questions.
Yeah, thank you. Sadhu, sadhu, Venerable.
Oh, I have to use the headphones.
Yeah. Thank you so much for offering such a wonderful talk, insightful talk. So now we begin question answer session. So I have received some question on the chat box. So I will, so first come first service. The first question, Christopher. So his question is, do these factor, joy, rapture, tranquility, calm, concentration, have any relation to the 7 factors of enlightenment, Bojanga?
Yeah, one could actually see several of the factors that are mentioned in this sequence. One could see them within the 7 factors of enlightenment. So we have, I'll underscore, we have rapture is a factor of enlightenment, tranquility, a factor of enlightenment, and samadhi, concentration, is a factor of enlightenment. So 3 of these factors that are mentioned here are also included in the 7 factors of enlightenment. And then it seems that, okay, the 7 factors of enlightenment begin with mindfulness, investigation of things as they are. Actually, investigation of things as they are could also be comprised perhaps under the knowledge and vision of things as they really are. Yeah, we have virya, energy, but energy is not mentioned in this sequence, but of course it's required. Yeah, so there's a great deal of overlap between the factors that are mentioned in this sequence and the 7 factors of enlightenment. Upekkha, equanimity, is a factor of enlightenment, which is not expressly mentioned here, but we might see it as implied by samadhi, by concentration. It's sort of the culmination of samadhi is equanimity.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Next question by Ming. When the mind remains stable and unwavering on the object, but not in the jhana, does Bhante means that the 5 hindrances are absent but not in first jhana?
Yeah, that would be a state in which the 5 hindrances have been overcome for a sustained period of time. So it's not necessarily equivalent to even to the first jhana.
Thank you. Next one from Rajan from Brazil. What could be the differences between our own Buddhist faith and Christian faith, since we do practice Kalama Sutta? Interesting question.
I would say that there are many different, let's say, shades or nuances and dimensions to comprise under the concept of faith. And often we say in Buddhism that we don't have blind faith, but we have faith based on investigation and inquiry. And while that is true, I don't want to say that all Christian faith is blind faith, that I say that different Christians will have based their faith on different grounds. For many Christians, it'll be blind faith, and also for Buddhists, that can be blind faith as well. But I say ideally, a Christian would base their faith on maybe their process of investigation until they gain a conviction in the truths of the revealed truths of their faith. And Buddhists also, through investigation and inquiry, we gain a trust and confidence in the teachings of the Buddha. I'd say in both Christianity and Buddhism, there are certain teachings that we cannot verify and confirm through our own experience in the initial stages that we accept on faith. For the Christian, it would be, I mean, I'm not an expert in Christian theology, but I think a Christian would say, particularly a Roman Catholic might say, the mystery of the Trinity, by which God can be, how does it express, three persons, one divinity with three persons, and the mystery of Jesus, who can be wholly God, and entirely human in one person. So those are, say, revealed teachings of Christianity that have to be accepted by faith. Whether there's a way to confirm those teachings through contemplative experience, that I don't know. In Buddhism, I would say what we accept on faith is first the teaching of karma and rebirth, though through the appropriate types of meditative development, it's possible, if one gains the fourth jhana, and then one develops these super knowledges based on the jhana, then one could see into the workings of karma and confirm the workings of karma and rebirth for oneself. And also we accept on faith that it's possible to entirely uproot the defilements and attain a complete cessation of suffering, attain an unconditioned state that's called nibbana. Where I would say maybe a key difference is that in Buddhism, we have a particular type of practice that we undertake, that as we put the teachings into practice, to the extent that we practice, our experience through practice will give a stronger and stronger confirmation of the trust that we place in the teachings. And it is when one reaches the stages of realization that we traditionally explain as the stage from stream entry up, that one sees into the truth of the teaching so that one can completely overcome doubt in the teaching. Anyway, that's the way I would deal with that question.
Very wonderful answer. Next question from Tay from Malaysia. His question is, I'm aware that focus on more hate and little thing will trigger my anger, which never happened before. Since my parent passed away, a part of me is empty. The mind has shifted its focus. How do I go back to the state of wholesome mind state?
Yeah, it seems that there are actually two questions here. And I'm not sure of the drift of the question. One is, how does one overcome hatred? And the other is how to overcome the grief that comes from the passing away of the person's parents.
Yeah.
Okay, overcoming hatred, of course, usually it's a difficult challenge, but the methods that the Buddha has taught, well, he's taught various methods, but the most effective method, the most powerful method, is the methodical, systematic development of loving kindness. And so even if one could invest just a short period each day, even 10 or 15 minutes, to systematically practicing loving kindness, one will find over time, with patience and persistence, that the disposition to hatred and ill will start to subside, and one will build up a powerful inner force to counteract hatred when it arises. Yeah, if you look in the Anguttara Nikaya Book of Fives, there are suttas which teach various methods for overcoming ill will and hatred. Yeah, you would have to look in the index. It's something like a sutta number 176, something like that. Okay, that's with dealing with ill will or hatred. Then for overcoming grief at the loss of parents, I say that often Buddhists have this kind of unrealistic ideal that they impose on themselves, that when a loved one passes away, I should just accept it with complete equanimity without feeling any sorrow or grief. I don't really agree with that. I think it's normal and natural to feel grief, and the feeling of grief is a way of reenacting the love, the gratitude that you had towards your loved one. But what we have to help us deal with the grief, to protect us from being overwhelmed and crushed by the grief, we have teachings rooted in wisdom that we could use again to address that problem of grief. So one of the helpful antidotes is the reflection that the Buddha teaches, that we should reflect often that I have to be parted and separated from everyone that I love. So if you reflect in this way, that parting is inevitable, you can let yourself feel the grief. But when you feel that grief, you're not clinging to unrealistic expectations that the relationship will be permanent. And in advance, all of us should do that reflection from time to time so that when we are parted from our loved ones, we won't be crushed from the grief. But in my opinion, it's a healthy experience to go through the grief and observe the grief with mindfulness. One could use mindfulness and sampajanya to understand the grief and let the grief be experienced as a way of reenacting your love, your gratitude, and your love and gratitude towards the person who has passed away. And then in time, naturally the grief, let's say the overwhelming force of the grief will diminish, but you'll still be able to think back and remember that person with the same love and gratitude.
Thank you, Venerable. Next question. Uh, what can you say about the middle way? What is the meaning of such existence?
Yeah, actually, the middle way is a very different topic that
Right.
I didn't really deal with here. But the Buddha explains the Noble Way as the Noble Eightfold Path. And all I could say is that the stages that are expounded here, we could say, are a different way of presenting. But let us say that these are the stages that unfold as one adopts and puts into practice the Noble Eightfold Path. But maybe we could say that the Buddha teaches the middle way as a middle way between the extremes of indulgence in sensual pleasure and the extreme of self-mortification or self-affliction. So because the Noble Eightfold Path avoids the extreme of sensual indulgence, it means that one is adopting a path that involves some degree of renunciation, detachment, withdrawal from the allure, from the attractions of sensual pleasures. And so the fact that one is adopting a path of self-cultivation, of inward cultivation, of moral, of ethical practice, developing concentration, developing wisdom, this entails that one is moving away from the extreme of sensual indulgence. But the other extreme, which is adopted by those who take up a spiritual path, at least in ancient India, is that of self-affliction, self-torment, which sometimes it's also taken by Buddhist practitioners who think that the way to observe the Dhamma properly is to make oneself suffer by extreme asceticism. But the stages here show that the path to liberation involves joy and happiness, that it's not, while it avoids sensual indulgence and the sensual pleasures, it's not a dry, dull, or painful path, but it's a path that brings inner joy, happiness, peace, and delight. And that makes it a middle path.
We still have a few more questions. Just we're running out of time, but let's take a few more. Okay. May Bhante share some guidance in how to continue to observe the object when mind is stable, but object seemingly disappears. In this case, the object is breath. Has it been able to let the rupture to settle down when mind is stable and inability to observe the object added discomfort to progress? This is from David Wong. It's very long.
Yeah, I didn't intend this lecture to be one based on giving meditation instruction, but what I would just say is that
maybe we need
when the breath becomes very fine and seems to disappear, I mean, that's a natural part in the process of contemplation of in and out breathing, of anapanasati. One just lets the mind settle in the area around the nostrils and just increase the mindfulness, try to put the gas pedal on the mindfulness to intensify the mindfulness. And as one does so, one will find that the breath is still present, that one could observe the in and out breathing. It's just that it's occurring now at a finer, subtle level, so that the sensation of the in and out breath is more subtle. So that it's not the ordinary coarse in and out breathing, but it's a very, very subtle feeling of inward pressure, inward pressure from the in-breath and outward pressure from the out-breath.
Thank you. Another question. I will take two more questions, then we.
Okay.
This is from Annie. May I understand the differences between the asava and the anusaya, or are they basically the same? Are the ways of overcoming these two set of defilement the same?
It's quite an interesting question. And because it seems to me that underlying the term asava and anusaya, there are metaphors. So both terms are referring to what we call defilements. And there's a certain overlap between them, but the underlying metaphor is different. So the asava, the underlying metaphor, as I explained earlier, is that of things that flow, either flowing into the mind, into the conscious mind from the depths of the unconscious, or flowing out from the mind through the senses. And then the underlying metaphor of anusaya, its anu means along with, and saya means lying down or sleeping. So things that lie along with the mental continuum. But certain asavas are also, certain defilements included among the asavas are also included among the anusayas. Let me see if I could get them. So there's a kama raga anusaya. The underlying tendency of sensual lust corresponds to the asava of sensual craving. And then there's a bhavarag anusaya, the underlying tendency of craving for existence corresponds to the bhav asava, the asava of craving for existence. And then there's an avij anusaya, the underlying tendency of ignorance, which corresponds to the avij asava, the asava of ignorance. And so 3 anusayas correspond to the three asavas, but there are some anusayas which don't have counterparts. among the asavas. There's doubt, ill will, mana, conceit, and ditti, anusaya, the underlying tendency of views. But then later texts, interestingly, come to add a fourth asava. We find this already in the early Abhidhamma. This is the dit asava, the asava of views. And so in this way, 4 asavas have counterparts among the anusayas.
So last question. This is from Philippine Venerable Miao Ching Su. Year
From where?
Philippine
Philippines. Wow.
Miao Ching Su Venerable.
Yeah.
Year 2020 is a difficult year filled with uncertainty and fear.
Yeah.
Number one, how shall we focus our thoughts? And second one, some non-Buddhist friends have lost their loved one.
Yeah.
It's dharma to comfort.
What was the last part?
Some non-Buddhist friends have lost their loved one.
Yeah.
Which dharma to comfort? Interfaith.
I didn't get the last phrase.
So some
Yeah,
of
that part I got. About comfort.
Their loved one.
Yeah.
Which dharma? I think what kind of dharma should we practice to comfort them? I think.
To comfort the friends who have lost their loved ones. I think the best way to comfort is to empathize with them and to share their grief and their sorrow, not to preach to them. Particularly if they're not Buddhists, you don't want to try to directly impose our faith, but you could use some of the themes that come in the Dharma but I say if one loses a loved one early who's died prematurely, it's very, very difficult to comfort a person in that situation. But I think just the most valuable contribution you can make to them is to show that you share their feelings and that you have deep empathy with them, but not to try to preach to them until they have succeeded to some extent in overcoming the sorrow that comes from the immediate loss of a loved one. That's my personal opinion.
So that's in our question answer session. Thank you, Venerable Bhikkhu
Okay.
for your
And
talk.
let me express my respect. I see Venerable Valpalapiyananda is on the call from the Los Angeles Dhammavicaya Vihara. So let me show respect to him. And I saw my old friend Tom Morris is on the call also.
And we are blessed to have you, and we are very fortunate for today's lecture.
Okay, so thank you all for joining us.
I would like to thank Baisali and Fong Venerable Srinanda who assisted me to organize this event. And also thank you everybody who attended and making today's event so successful. And have a pleasant evening. Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye-bye. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.